Out in the pine-dotted low country along Georgia's coast, there sits a plantation where labor continued for nearly 2 full years after the Civil War had officially ended. Not because the workers refused to walk away, not because the law simply overlooked them, but because the landowners made a deliberate choice, one that demanded silence, isolation, and the ongoing collusion of every white authority figure within a 50-mile radius. When federal investigators finally arrived in the summer of 1866, they encountered something one officer described in his field notes as an arrangement of obvious intention. Its workings, he wrote, suggested premeditation on a scale rarely seen by this office. He noted that the workers, men, women, and children, had been restrained not by iron, but by something far more effective, the complete control of what they were allowed to know. They had been convinced the war was still raging, that the Union had fallen, that freedom for people like them would never arrive. The investigators' report was logged, stamped, filed away, and then disappeared from public view for 83 years. What unfolded on that land involved nothing supernatural. No monsters, no curses, no forces beyond explanation. What it required was something far more unsettling. Men who understood human psychology well enough to construct a prison with no visible walls. Before we go further into the story of Heartwell Plantation and those trapped there, if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We dig into the darkest, most neglected corners of American history, and we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Knowing your location helps us uncover stories that resonate closer to home. Because this story, this precise, methodical human atrocity, should never have been allowed to fade. To truly grasp what happened at Heartwell, you first have to understand what the Georgia Low Country like in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and again in 1865, when the Confederacy crumbled. McIntosh County occupies a narrow coastal strip shaped by salt marshes, tidal rivers, and an oppressive, suffocating heat that arrives by April and refuses to relent until November. The county seat, Darien, had been razed in June 1863, not by Confederate troops, but by a regiment of black Union soldiers under Colonel James Montgomery, retaliating for the town's complicity in the coastal slave trade. By war's end, McIntosh County was, by nearly any measure, a shattered place. Its white planter elite had lost sons, land, and the entire economic structure they had built their lives around. Its black population, over 2 Zalzers at the war's peak, had spent generations within a social order that treated them as chattel, tracked their movements, policed their speech, and systematically cut them off from any knowledge that might give them power over their own existence. Heartwell Plantation was not the county's largest. It comprised roughly 100 acres of arable land along the Altamaha River, given over to long staple cotton and modest rice cultivation in the tidal marshes nearer the water. Its owner in the war's final years was Cornelius Heartwell, third in his family to work this particular stretch of Georgia earth. He was 51 in 1865. He had not enlisted in the Confederate Army, citing a chronic lung condition that, depending on the account, either genuinely limited his stamina or was conveniently deployed whenever conscription officers appeared. He had 2 sons. The elder Edmund had perished at Chickamauga in 1863. The younger Prentice had come home in April 1865 with a mangled left hand and a reticence that his mother, Cecilia, found more alarming than the wound itself. In the war's closing weeks, as reports of Confederate surrenders filtered down from Atlanta and up from Savannah, Cornelius Heartwell retreated to his study and did what few men in his position were willing to do. He thought with absolute clarity. He was not given to outbursts or denial. By the accounts of those who knew him professionally, He was systematic, the sort who kept flawless ledgers, read legal texts thoroughly, and anticipated trouble before it arrived. And in those final weeks of April and May 1865, he foresaw a crisis that most of his neighbors, too grief-stricken or enraged, failed to properly consider. That crisis was labor. At that time, Heartwell held approximately 63 enslaved individuals working his land. Some had been there for decades. Others were the children and grandchildren of people his father had owned. They ranged from the very young to the very old. A multi-generational community whose entire existence had been shaped around Heartwell's field schedules. Heartwell's rules, Heartwell's authority. Within weeks, they would be legally free. What Cornelius Heartwell grasped more sharply than his neighbors was that freedom was not merely a moral or philosophical condition. It was a logistical one. It depended on information, on the ability to move, to communicate, to verify what you had been told. And in the Georgia Low Country in the spring of 1865, for people who had been deliberately kept illiterate, who had no newspapers, no contact with federal officials, no way to leave the property without permission, freedom was not automatic. It had to reach you, and for it to reach you, no one in your immediate world could actively work to prevent it. Cornelius Heartwell set about that prevention at once. He did not, as far as any record shows, share his full strategy with his wife or with Prentice. He worked quietly, efficiently, and with a patience that, in hindsight, makes the entire affair more chilling, not less. In the second week of May 1865, roughly a week after the last major Confederate surrender in the Deep South, Cornelius Heartwell assembled the plantation's workers at the edge of the main yard. That dusty sun-scorched open space between the row of cabins and the barns. He had done this before, for planting announcements, dispute resolutions, warnings. This time he arrived holding a letter. The document was real, with an authentic seal, but it was not what he represented it to be. He informed them that the war had taken a new turn, that Union forces had suffered a devastating defeat in Virginia. The specifics were vague, by design, and that President Lincoln, facing political ruin, had suspended the Emancipation Proclamation as part of a temporary armistice. He told them that the legal status of enslaved people in Confederate states remained unchanged, that anyone who left the property or tried to contact federal authorities would be violating existing law and would be turned over by local sheriffs or Confederate Home Guard, remnants still active in the area, to face punishment. He delivered all of this calmly, letter in hand, held up but never passed around. None of it was true, but for the men and women standing in that yard under the brutal Georgia May sun, there was no way to check. No newspaper, no federal presence within reach. The nearest town of any size, Darien, was still largely in ruins, and every white authority figure in their immediate world, the county sheriff, the local magistrate, the overseers from neighboring plantations, was, through arrangements Heartwell had already begun to set in motion, prepared to corroborate his account, if questioned. The workers dispersed back to their cabins in silence. The next morning, they returned to the fields. What occurred in the days immediately following that gathering has been reconstructed mainly from testimonies given to Freedmen's Bureau agents in the fall of 1866. Those testimonies were fragmentary, offered by people who had endured sustained psychological pressure for over a year, and who, even after gaining freedom, often struggled to reconstruct the precise sequence of events. But across those accounts, certain details recur with enough consistency to suggest reliability. One worker, a man in his late 30s, who would later choose the name August Grover, after the month of his actual liberation, described the assembly in terms that remained consistent across two separate interviews months apart. He said Cornelius Heartwell had spoken softly, almost gently. No shouting, no threats of violence, no visible weapons. The performance of authority had been entirely procedural. A man with a document explaining a legal situation. He didn't look afraid of us, Grover told the bureau agent. That was what made me believe him. A man who's lying looks scared, you'll find out. He didn't look scared at all. That composure, that flawless performative calm, was itself evidence. It indicated Heartwell knew precisely what he was doing. He was not panicking. He was not improvising. He had thought this through. And over the following weeks, as summer intensified and cotton rose high in the Altamaha fields, he continued to hone and sustain the deception with a precision that bordered on the methodical. To understand how a hoax of this magnitude could be maintained for nearly 2 years, it helps to grasp the geography of isolation. Heartwell Plantation was not remote or hidden. A road led from the property into Darien, and Darien, even burned and damaged, still had functioning commerce and a small white populace. But that road was traveled only by those who knew what awaited them at either end. For the workers on Heartwell's land, what lay in Darien was not freedom. It was a white community that, in 1865 coastal Georgia, was overwhelmingly hostile to any black person, appearing without explicit authorization from an employer. And the social structure of the Low Country was designed, even in peacetime, to make unauthorized movement perilous. This did not require an active conspiracy among every white person in the county. It only required that the default response of white authorities, sheriffs, merchants, local officials, was to be suspicious and unhelpful toward any black person whose presence could not be explained by an employer. Heartwell did not need to orchestrate an elaborate county-wide plot. He only needed to ensure that the people most likely to correct his workers, understanding of the law, were not going to do so willingly. In the weeks after his announcement, Heartwell made several discreet visits to neighboring landowners and a few key figures in Darien. The details of those conversations are unrecorded. They could not be, given their nature, but their effects can be inferred from what followed. When, over the summer and fall of 1865, several workers from Heartwell's property made cautious attempts to gather intelligence, approaching a neighboring farm, speaking to a worker from another property who occasionally passed on the road. They received confirmation of Heartwell's story, or at least enough ambiguity to keep them from acting on their suspicions. That ambiguity was no accident. In a region where the planter class had, for generations, controlled information as a tool of social management, the instinct to back a neighbor's version of events over a black laborer's confusion was not so much a moral choice as a reflex. The social system produced cooperation without Heartwell having to explicitly ask for it. There was also the matter of the Freedmen's Bureau. Established in March 1865, the Bureau was charged specifically with aiding formerly enslaved people in their transition to freedom. By fall 1865, it had agents operating in Georgia, but its reach in rural coastal counties was severely constrained by understaffing, by the active obstruction of local white officials, who thwarted its efforts at every turn, and by the simple geographic reality that agents covering vast territories could not visit every property, chase every rumor, or verify every report of labor irregularities. Heartwell was not on anyone's immediate radar. In the meantime, life on the plantation continued in its familiar grooves. The early morning bell, the endless rows of cotton stretching to the tree line, the evening return to the cabins, meals cooked over the same fires, children playing in the same dust. The rhythms of coercion had been so thoroughly embedded into daily existence that they required little active enforcement. The system ran on inertia, on the accumulated weight of routine, on the ingrained assumption that the world beyond the property was more dangerous than the world within it. But something was stirring in the cabins at night, something Cornelius Heartwell had not fully anticipated. People were talking. In particular, an older woman named Delphine Cray, known simply as Delphine among the workers, a woman in her late 50s, born on the property, whose mother had died there, had begun quietly and carefully to gather intelligence. She could not read, but by multiple later accounts, she possessed exceptional memory and analytical insight. She had listened to Heartwell's announcement with a distinctive kind of attention, the sort honed over decades of being required to appear invisible in the presence of white authority, and of using that invisibility to hear things not meant for her. What she noticed in the weeks following the announcement was a particular shift in behavior among the white household members. Cecilia Heartwell, Cornelius's wife, had always been a woman of rigid, exacting social habits. She received visitors on set days. She corresponded with relatives in Savannah and Augusta through a regular mail system. But after the announcement, Cecilia Heartwell had stopped receiving guests. Her correspondence, as far as Delphine could gauge from the movement of mail through the house. And she had reason to observe this, having worked in the main house for years, had contracted sharply. The Heartwells were not inviting people to the property. They were not hosting. They were managing their social exposure. To Delphine, that was the behavior of people guarding a secret. She did not yet know what the secret was. Not exactly, but she knew enough to begin a different kind of listening. In early 1866, the deception began to buckle under its own weight. The first real crack came not from inside the plantation, but from outside. And not from a federal agent or bureau official, but from a man named Henry Odom, one of the most improbable sources imaginable. A poor white farmer from the northern edge of McIntosh County, who had no particular sympathy for the formerly enslaved and no political stake in Reconstruction, but who had a very practical interest in free labor markets. Odom was trying to establish a small farm of his own. In early 1866, he had been contracting with freed black workers from surrounding properties who had negotiated their own labor arrangements under the emerging sharecropping and contract systems. His land was modest, barely 100 acres, but he was ambitious and competitive, and he grew increasingly frustrated by what he saw as Cornelius Heartwell's unfair advantage. Heartwell's plantation was producing cotton at a rate that made no economic sense, given what Odom knew about current labor costs. Odom was not a man of refined sensibilities, but he understood numbers, and the numbers from Heartwell's operation suggested a labor cost approaching zero. In the spring of 1866, Odom filed a complaint with the county freedmen's bureau agent, not out of moral outrage, but out of competitive resentment. He wanted an investigation. He believed Heartwell was suppressing the free labor market through some arrangement that amounted to fraud. The bureau agent, a 26-year-old Ohioan named James Pruitt, who had been in the county less than 4 months and was handling an overwhelming caseload across 3 districts, initially filed Odom's complaint at the bottom of a large stack of grievances. It was the kind of complaint he received regularly, white farmers accusing each other of improprieties, often with self-serving motives. It did not immediately suggest anything more serious than a contractual dispute. What elevated it to the top of his attention, about 3 weeks later, was a second report. This one came from a woman who had worked on a neighboring property and had recently relocated to Darien after her own contract negotiations. In the course of those talks, She had spoken with a man she knew from her former property, who had a relative on Heartwell's land. What she relayed to Pruitt was indirect, second-hand fragmentary, but its essence was this: the workers on Heartwell's plantation did not know the war was over. Pruitt sat with that sentence for a long time. Then he wrote to his supervisory agent in Savannah, Colonel Thomas Hatch, a former officer known for both procedural rigor and personal impatience. Describing what he had heard, he requested authorization to conduct a formal visit to the Heartwell property. Authorization came within a week, but what followed introduced a delay of nearly 2 months. A delay that, in retrospect, looks less like bureaucratic sluggishness and more like active interference. The day before Pruitt was scheduled to ride to Heartwell's, he received a visit from the McIntosh County Sheriff, a man named Larson Gale. Gale was polite but direct. He brought a document, a labor contract, signed with what appeared to be 3 marks, from representatives of the Heartwell workers, acknowledging that they had been informed of their free status and had agreed to continue working for Cornelius Heartwell under a wage arrangement. The signatures were X beside printed names. They could have been made by anyone. Gale told Pruitt that an investigation of Heartwell's property was unnecessary and would disrupt a functioning legal arrangement. He suggested, not threatened, but suggested, that Pruitt's resources would be better spent on properties where genuine abuses were occurring. Pruitt was young, new to the county, and uncertain of what he was dealing with. But he wrote everything down. He recorded Gale's visit, the document, the names on the contract, and the fact that it had occurred exactly 1 day before his scheduled inspection. That timing, he noted in his journal, was no coincidence. Inside Heartwell Plantation, through the late winter and into the spring of 1866, Delphine Cray had been quietly constructing something. It had no formal name. It was not organized in any way an outsider would recognize as an organization. It was, at its core, a network of careful listeners, people who trusted her, people she had known for decades, people whose judgment she had tested and found sound. There were 9 of them, ranging from a 22-year-old man named Solomon Price to an older man in his late 40s named Reuben Tanner, a skilled carpenter before the war who had, over the years, built relationships with white tradesmen in Darien that occasionally gave him reason to travel into town. It was Tanner who, in March of 1866, brought back a scrap of information that changed everything. He had been sent to Darien by Heartwell to buy hardware for a fence repair. A trip Heartwell had calculated as safe because Tanner's movements in town would be observed, and because Tanner had shown, over many years, a reliable and compliant demeanor. What Heartwell had not calculated was that Tanner, through his years of trade contacts, had developed a specific relationship with a black freedman in Darien named Marcus Sewell, who ran a small repair shop on the edge of the burned district. Sewell, unlike the workers at Heartwell's, was fully free. He had been free since February 1865, had registered with the Freedmen's Bureau, had signed labor contracts in his own name, and had been operating his business openly for over a year. When Tanner appeared in his doorway, looking, as Sewell would later testify, like a man who had stepped out of a time already gone, Sewell recognized immediately that something was wrong. The exchange between them was brief. Sewell could not afford to be seen in prolonged conversation with a man from a known plantation. The social surveillance networks of the county cut both ways, and he had his own livelihood to protect. But he was direct. He told Tanner the war had been over for nearly a year, that Lincoln had been assassinated, that there was a Freedmen's Bureau office with an agent specifically tasked to help people in Tanner's situation, and that the contracts Heartwell claimed were in effect were almost certainly fraudulent. Tanner bought his hardware. He walked back to the road, and then he returned to Heartwell's property and told no one what he had heard. Not for 4 days. Those 4 days are documented in his later testimony, and they represent some of the most psychologically acute passages in the Bureau's records from this period. Tanner described an internal debate, testing what Sewell had told him against everything Heartwell had told them, against the visible reality of life on the property, against each small observation he had made over the past year. He recounted specific moments of doubt. The way Heartwell's wife had stopped entertaining visitors. The absence, now that he considered it, of any Confederate soldiers in the area. The fact that a federal agent had appeared at a neighboring property months earlier and had not been attacked or driven off by Confederate forces, as Heartwell had claimed would happen to any Union presence. He also described something else, something harder to classify clinically, but which comes through in his testimony with striking clarity: fear. Not fear of Heartwell. Fear of hope. Fear that if he told the others what he had heard, and it turned out to be wrong, another lie, a test engineered by Heartwell to identify the most restless among them, the consequences would be severe. The deception had done something to his capacity to trust information. It had made hope itself feel dangerous. On the 5th day, he told Delphine. She listened to everything he said without interruption. Then she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, and this is preserved in her testimony nearly verbatim, because the Bureau agent who recorded it wrote it exactly as she spoke. I knew he was lying. I didn't know what the truth was. Now I do. Over the following 2 weeks, with a caution that Tanner found almost physically painful, Delphine and he determined their course. They would not leave the property en masse. That was a scenario Delphine had thoroughly considered, and it carried too much risk. Not from Heartwell directly, but from the county infrastructure of white authority that had sustained his deception. If they moved as a group, they would be visible, likely intercepted, and they had no proof. Nothing an outside authority would immediately recognize as evidence of what had been done to them. What they needed was a federal agent. Specifically, they needed the Freedmen's Bureau agent to come to the property. Not in response to an external complaint, but in response to something the agent himself had set in motion. And they needed to be ready, when he arrived, to speak clearly about what had happened, with enough corroborating voices that their testimony could not be dismissed. For that, they needed time. And they needed to continue visibly and apparently willingly with the routines of the plantation. To keep appearing, under Heartwell's observation, exactly as they had always appeared. What Delphine and Tanner were doing in those weeks was the inverse of what Heartwell had done to them. They were managing his perception of their knowledge. They were performing a version of themselves he expected to see, while beneath that performance, they were building something that would outlast it. The tension of that period, living inside the deception while dismantling it from within, is almost impossible to reconstruct fully from documentary evidence. But the testimonies of multiple workers describe a quality to those weeks that one Bureau agent characterized in his report as an almost unbearable precision of self-control. They kept working the fields. They kept responding to the bell. They kept their faces in Heartwell's presence, exactly as they had always been. And then, in late May of 1866, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. James Prewitt, the Bureau agent, finally arranged a second inspection visit to the Heartwell property, this time without notifying the county sheriff in advance. And Cornelius Heartwell, who had maintained his composure for over a year, made his first mistake. The mistake was Prentice. In the 3 weeks before Pruitt's arrival, Prentice Heartwell had been drinking more than usual. He was 24. His hand would never fully function again, and whatever he had witnessed in the battles where he'd served had left residue in him that he could not seem to purge through any available means. He had always been, by accounts from neighbors and family correspondents, the less stable of the 2 Heartwell sons, impulsive where Edmund had been steady, prone to emotional storms where Edmund had been calm. His father had managed him by keeping him peripheral to plantation operations, giving him tasks meaningful enough to occupy him, but not consequential enough to endanger the more delicate aspects of the arrangement. In the first week of June 1866, Prentice got drunk in the evening and walked to the worker cabins. He didn't intend to reveal anything. He wasn't carrying a confession. He was carrying, instead, a grievance. The specific whiskey-fueled grievance of a young man who had given up something enormous and received nothing useful in return. He wanted someone to acknowledge that the world had been destroyed and rebuilt wrong. He wanted someone to listen without the composed, measured responses his father demanded of all household interactions. What he said to the 2 workers he found still awake outside a cabin near the road was not a direct admission. It was fragmented, emotional, largely incoherent. But within it, repeated in different forms, was a phrase both workers later testified to clearly. "You all don't even know what you are now. You don't even know." They did know, of course, by then. Delphine's network had carefully shared the information with every adult on the property over the preceding weeks. But they gave Prentice nothing. No reaction, no question, no indication his words had landed anywhere significant. They listened with the faces they had practiced. When he finally wandered back toward the main house, they sat in silence for several minutes before one of them spoke. Solomon Price, the youngest member of Delphine's network, had witnessed the conversation from inside the cabin through a gap in the planking. He went to Delphine before dawn. The next morning, James Pruitt arrived at Heartwell Plantation with 2 accompanying officers and a mandate from the Savannah Bureau office that was, this time, not easily sidestepped. Cornelius Heartwell met them at the road. He was, by all accounts, entirely composed. He invited them onto the property, offered water, presented the labor contracts, including the one with the X marks that Sheriff Gale had shown Pruitt months earlier. He spoke about the challenges of the transition period, the importance of maintaining agricultural productivity in a disrupted region, his respect for the legal process, and his full cooperation with Bureau oversight. Pruitt listened to all of it, and then he asked to speak with the workers directly, without Heartwell present. That was the moment. Heartwell had prepared for many contingencies, but he had not fully prepared for a federal officer who had done enough homework to know that any interview conducted in the employer's presence was, effectively, not an interview at all. The legal authority was clear. Pruitt had the right to conduct private interviews, and Heartwell, faced with 2 armed officers and a formal bureau mandate, had no legal mechanism to prevent it. He said calmly that he had no objection. He was lying again, but this time he had no way to make the lie effective. Pruitt conducted interviews throughout the day, beginning with workers he selected at random from the fields. Within the first hour, the shape of what he was looking at became unmistakable. The workers he spoke with, even those who had not been part of Delphine's inner network, even those who had only recently received the information through that quiet underground, gave him a consistent account, not because they had coordinated their testimony, but because the truth, once confirmed, tends to organize itself clearly. By midday, Pruitt had spoken with 14 workers, He had documented in detailed notes the specific contents of Heartwell's original announcement in May 1865. The false claims about Lincoln, the armistice, the suspension of the proclamation. He had documented the information management that followed. He had documented the labor performed, the absence of wages, the social isolation of the property. In the afternoon, he asked specifically for Delphine. She had been waiting all day with a patience she had been practicing in various forms for nearly a year. She sat across from Pruitt in the shade of a storage building and answered every question in full, measured sentences, with a quality of recall that Pruitt described in his report as remarkable in its precision and consistency. She described the initial announcement. She described the behavioral changes in the Heartwell household that had first signaled to her that something was wrong. She described Tanner's trip to Darien and his conversation with Marcus Sewell. She described the network she had built, the decision-making process, the 4 weeks of continued labor under deliberate concealment of what they knew. Pruitt asked her why they hadn't simply left once they knew, why they had stayed another month. Delphine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Pruitt included verbatim in his official report. "We needed a witness. Leaving just gets us back to where we were, moving through a county full of people who would rather not see us. Staying meant we could hand you the proof in one place. He built this very carefully. We needed to take it apart the same way." Pruitt sat with his notes that evening and wrote a 22-page preliminary report. He listed the names of every worker he had interviewed. He listed the specific false claims Heartwell had made. He cataloged the labor, cotton harvested, fields worked, man-hours estimated, and calculated a financial figure representing unpaid wages for approximately 63 workers over roughly 22 months. The number was substantial. He also listed the names of individuals he believed had knowingly supported the deception, including Sheriff Larson Gale, 2 neighboring property owners, and a magistrate whose role in confirming Heartwell's false legal claims had been described by multiple workers. Cornelius Heartwell was formally notified that evening that his labor arrangements were void and that he was under investigation for fraud and violation of federal civil rights statutes. He stood in his doorway when Pruitt delivered the notification, and he was still composed. His face didn't change. He said he expected the matter would be resolved through proper legal channels. He was wrong about what those channels would deliver, though he didn't know that yet. The case against Cornelius Heartwell moved through the Bureau's legal system over the following 8 months, producing a documentary record that is both substantial and, in its ultimate outcome, characteristic of the period in ways that are not satisfying to anyone seeking a tidy conclusion. What the investigation confirmed in full was this: for approximately 22 months after the Civil War ended, 63 men, women, and children had continued to labor on Heartwell Plantation under the sustained, deliberately maintained false belief that they were still legally enslaved. They had been held not by physical chains, but by the systematic management of information, by the deliberate withholding of news, by the fabrication of false legal documents, by the coordination of a social network of white authority figures who, through active participation or complicit silence, had ensured the truth could not reach them. The financial calculation Pruitt included in his report, the back wages owed to those workers, was never paid. This was not a failure of the investigation. The investigation was, by Bureau standards, thorough. Pruitt's report was accepted, amplified by Colonel Hatch's office in Savannah, and forwarded to the military authority governing Georgia's Reconstruction District. The case was real. The evidence was real. The legal violations were clear. What was not clear in 1866 and 1867 was who had the authority to enforce remedies against a white Georgia landowner in a state whose political reconstruction was proceeding through layers of resistance, negotiation, and deliberate legal obstruction by state and local officials. The military courts that had jurisdiction were operating in a political environment that was already beginning to contract. The political will in Washington for aggressive Reconstruction enforcement was, even in 1866, starting to erode under the pressure of President Johnson's active hostility toward the project and the resistance of Southern white political culture at every level. Cornelius Heartwell was not imprisoned. He was assessed a formal penalty, a fine whose amount was set at a fraction of what the unpaid wages would have totaled, and which itself was subject to a lengthy appeals process that further reduced its practical impact. Sheriff Larson Gale was removed from his position by the military authority overseeing Reconstruction in the district, one of the more tangible outcomes of the investigation. But within 2 years, he was restored to a similar post through the normal mechanisms of Georgia local politics. The neighboring property owners and the magistrate listed in Prewitt's report were investigated and found to have provided, in the Bureau's careful legal language, material support and voluntary causes altitude through to voluntary servitude through deliberate misinformation that finded and resulted in formal letters of censure filed and in a federal record that, within a decade, no one in McIntosh County was actively maintaining. Prewitt's full 22-page report was filed with the Bureau's Central Records Office in Washington in the fall of 1866. It was cataloged, stamped, and stored in 1872, when the Freedmen's Bureau was formally dissolved by Congress. Its mission declared, with considerable political dishonesty, to be essentially complete. Its records were transferred to the War Department. They sat there organized but largely unread for decades. In 1949, a historian named Marion Calhoun Hess, researching Georgia Reconstruction labor practices for a book on sharecropping, found Prewitt's report in a box of transferred Bureau documents at the National Archives. She recognized immediately what she was reading. The book she published the following year included a chapter on Heartwell Plantation that remains the most detailed secondary account of the case. Her work generated a brief period of scholarly attention and then receded as academic work on specific Reconstruction era cases tends to do, into the specialized bibliography of a field that the general reading public has not, then or since, fully engaged with. The workers themselves, the 63 people whose lives were suspended in that deliberate historical pause, dispersed after the investigation concluded. Some went to Darien, some went to Savannah, some left Georgia entirely, joining the early streams of black migration to northern cities that would, over the following decades, become one of the defining demographic movements of American history. Delphine Cray went to Savannah. She settled in a neighborhood near the waterfront, in a boarding house run by a woman she had known slightly before the war. She lived another 11 years. She never learned to read, but by multiple accounts from people who knew her in those final years, she was a woman of formidable presence. Someone who listened with unusual attention, who asked questions that seemed simple, but turned out not to be, and who had a specific, sometimes unsettling habit of identifying when the people around her were not telling the truth. Reuben Tanner settled in Darien, working again as a carpenter. He and Marcus Sewell, the freedman whose brief conversation in the hardware shop had been the original crack in the deception, established a working relationship that lasted years. Whether they ever spoke specifically about what had happened, there is no record. Solomon Price, the youngest member of the network Delphine had built, made his way eventually to Philadelphia. He lived until 1921. He left no published memoir, but a granddaughter, interviewed in the 1970s as part of a local oral history project, described him as a man who had very strong feelings about who controls what you know. She said, he had told her more than once that the most dangerous thing that could ever be done to a person was not to hurt them. It was to manage what they believed. If you can do that, she quoted him saying, you don't need anything else. Cornelius Heartwell died in 1879 of the lung condition he had always claimed to have, which turned out to be genuine after all. Prentice Heartwell sold the property in 1883. It passed through several owners over the following decades. Its history as a Reconstruction era fraud case largely unknown to those who worked and lived on it afterward. The land is still there. The tidal fields along the Altamaha still flood in the same seasons. The pine-flecked low country still holds its heat until November. What happened on that property was not a mystery in the sense that most mysteries are mysteries. Something unknown, something requiring supernatural explanation, something beyond the reach of human comprehension. It was in every way entirely comprehensible. That is perhaps the most disturbing thing about it. A man looked at a community of people, assessed what they knew and what they didn't know, calculated what it would take to maintain a specific gap in their understanding, and then did it quietly, methodically, for nearly 2 years. And the machinery that made it possible. The social architecture of a post-war Southern county, the information isolation of a rural community, the institutional indifference that filed a federal report and then lost it for 83 years. That machinery was not unique to Heartwell Plantation. It was the ordinary infrastructure of a particular American world at a particular American moment. Heartwell didn't build it. He just knew how to use it. This mystery shows us something that has no comfortable resolution. That the most efficient forms of control never require force. They require only the careful management of what people are allowed to know. The chains that held those 63 people in place from May of 1865 to June of 1866 were made of nothing but information withheld with precision. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or are there layers of this that even the investigators never fully uncovered? Leave your comment below. There are stories like this one, buried in every county of every southern state, and we want to find them. If this episode gave you chills, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who cares about the real history of this country. The parts that don't appear in the textbooks. See you in the next video. A file content end.